into the lobby. And our first presenter was Allison Rogerson. She's having some tech issues, so we're going to go ahead and go to our next presenter, who is Kurt Chang. He is the Shellfish Program Manager with Partnership for the Delaware Estuary, and we'll be hearing about the Nispillian Harbor Living Shoreline Project. So thanks so much, Kurt. Take it away.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself when I started presenting. Can you all see this?
Not yet.
Okay, 1 second. Okay, we're good now?
Looks great. Thanks, Kurt.
All right, sorry about that. Hi, everyone. My name is Kurt Chang, and I work for the Partnership for the Delaware Estuary. As Danielle said, I'm the Shellfish Programs Manager, and I primarily work with shellfish, but I've been helping with living shorelines throughout my 10 plus years at the partnership. And today I'll be touching upon a project at the Nispillian Harbor in Milford, Delaware. I'll just caveat and say I'm not necessarily the expert on this project. Josh Moody was kind of a leading person on the project, as was our science director, Danielle Krieger. Okay, so why did we want to work here? It wasn't so much of a problem, perhaps, but a research opportunity. As we looked up and down the Delaware coastline, we noticed some fledgling oyster reefs, in particular intertidal oyster reefs. And so we started thinking, how could we potentially upscale the water quality benefits that these oysters would be providing to these areas? How could we maybe connect some of the habitats that seemed a bit disjointed? So we had these intertidal oyster reefs, we had mudflats, there was some low and high marsh, there was a little bit of erosion here and there, nothing major, but we saw it as an opportunity to get some data before and after our project. So again, as I said, the primary goal for this project was water quality enhancement. And I'll take a step back and just say that all of the work that we've done and all the work that we typically do is entirely grant funded. And so we tend to, that's just how we operate. So it's both a constraint, but also, it provides us with certain pathways. And so with regard to water quality, we wanted to see, again, how could we support this existing site by increasing the shellfish biomass. That biomass would translate into seasonal water quality benefits and ultimately some kind of nutrient removal. So there was a lot of other back-end research that we paired with the actual installation of the site. Secondarily, we also wanted to look at our ecological enhancement. So looking at sediment accretion through capture of sediment and establishing that vegetation, primarily Spartina alterniflora in the low marsh, and just monitoring all of our different metrics through time. In terms of design, I think, again, primarily we started with a more traditional approach of coir logs, and we had these kind of cusps that would kind of hug the shoreline in some of these areas that we saw some denuded areas. We've had previous success at the Morris River with these kinds of basic designs. And so that's what we started out with. And, to cut to the chase later, we ended up adjusting things as nature played out, and we responded to that through some adaptive management. Down on the lower left hand, I suppose, corner of the shoreline, you can see where we installed some of the oyster castles. And so that was more away from that shoreline. So this was a hybrid design. It wasn't just all soft materials. We had harder materials lower into the intertidal zone. In terms of permitting, real quick, we initially got permitted in 2014, and then we got renewals in 2018 as we expanded our living shoreline. We secured our nationwide permit 27, and then we also got our subaqueous lands permit from Delaware. I think the Delaware permitting may have changed slightly, but that's what we did back in the day. In terms of permit considerations, most of where we work, we have time of year restrictions for the red knot, so we're pretty used to that. Some of the other stipulations in the permit were things like not stockpiling materials on the subaqueous lands or wetlands. And then another thing I just want to throw in here in terms of the site characteristics, not necessarily for permitting, but there was old pilings all throughout that area, and then there was a sharp bend with some water velocity, so that kind of influenced I consider that more of like a hurdle. In terms of implementation, again, we're entirely grant funded. This was more focused on research. It wasn't kind of like a set it and forget it type thing. We primarily used our own staff as well as volunteers over many days, lots of augmentations. The quick rundown is that we manually moved materials from parking lots or other people's facilities where they graciously allowed us to store things. We used plywood boards and wheelbarrows as best as possible. Again, going back to those old pilings and that water velocity, it wasn't, even if we could pay for heavy machinery or barges or anything, it wasn't really a great site with access for large equipment. So yeah, all of our installations were by hand. Just as an example of some of the materials we've used in the past, this was for the first installation from 2014 through 2016. You can see the variety of different materials as well as the number of materials. So it was a fairly large effort over many years. And then in terms going right to monitoring and success metrics, you can see on the left-hand side, this is taken from our report, which outlines a lot more of the information than what I could present to you now. The takeaway is simply that we had those two main goals, ecological enhancement and water quality enhancement. And we had very clear metrics and methods to get to those goals, as well as the types of analysis that we expected to do to see how we were meeting those goals. This was just an example I wanted to share in terms of long-term monitoring. We standardized our transects through RTK GPS, and we went back to those transects as best we could throughout the entire time of installation, throughout monitoring, and even today we still have these transects. We still plan to go out and extend our data sets. And so just having that the stability of your transects or whatever you're looking at was really something that we, looking back, it was great that we did that. And we'll continue to do that at this site and other sites. So some of the data that we gathered, in general, we saw some accretion, we saw some erosion in the treated versus the untreated. In terms of vegetation, we saw some vertical growth, but again, all this is stemming out of those transect, that framework. When we're talking about water quality, in general, you can see on the left-hand side, there's eastern oysters and rib mussels, and you can see those populations begin to recruit, particularly with the oysters, and then start to level off. And so you see this natural kind of population stabilization. But if you look at the numbers, what we're seeing is kind of a leveling off and an establishment of that population. And on the right-hand side, again, we're looking at the population density. You might see initial spike, but again, it's not just like 1 or 2 years. It's that 4th, 5th, 6th year of monitoring where you really start to see some good results and some trends that you can feel confident about anyway. In terms of adaptive management, initially, like I said, we installed coir logs. However, there was some icing and some severe storms and things. And so we essentially replaced those coir logs with shell bags. And the shell bags provided very similar accretion benefits as those logs. However, they were a little more stable. And also those rib mussels that were in that low marsh were able to start colonizing some of those shell bags where we don't really see rib mussels colonize the coir logs. So in conclusion, we had some loss of coir logs. We had some loss of castles. Ice is a challenge. Again, this is a fledgling intertidal oyster reef. We didn't expect initial success. I think it did a lot better than we expected it. We created habitat, we created oysters. There's a lot more oysters and a lot more rib mussels there than we had before. And that satisfied our goal for water quality. Right smack in the middle, we see this paper authored by Josh and Sarah, as well as some other people at PDE. So feel free to check that out. I know Josh is on the committee. He could probably say a lot more than I can. So yeah, I think the last thing I'll say is just, consistent tending is what we really benefited from. We didn't just walk away. We addressed some problems in the first place, and then we saw the population start to rebound. So with that, I'll take any questions later, or feel free to email Sarah. I'm also always available. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kurt. We do have time for 1 or 2 questions if anyone has something outstanding that they want to ask. You can raise your hand or just come off mute. Anecdotally, did you determine areas where you found mussels more congregated than others? Did you find that it was correlated with elevation or certain material types?
I think the best lesson was certainly material type. And I think we have some other data suggesting that those shell bags are providing that interstitial space for rib mussels to both recruit, but also kind of be protected from either outside forces, whether physical or even predation. But yeah, the shell bags really worked well. And again, where you had those existing populations, it was a lot easier to kind of see that natural progression of the population. I don't think we've really had much anecdotal evidence of kind of just putting out shell bags with no populations nearby, and all of a sudden they'll recruit to them. Certainly it can happen, but we haven't really saw too much of that.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kurt. Allison, do you want to check to make sure your microphone's working? No. Oh my goodness. Do you want to, I don't know how horrible this would sound if you called me and I put your voice next to my computer. Do you want to try that? I emailed you my cell phone number. We can try that. So sorry for this issue, Allison. While Allison's calling me, I'll go ahead and introduce her. Allison Rogerson is oh, don't. Okay. If you again. Okay. So sorry. All right. Quinn, would you like to go next while Allison works on her tech issues?
Sure.
Great.
Yeah.
Quinn Whitesall McCarran is a habitat restoration coordinator for American Littoral Society, and she works a lot on the Delaware Bay shoreline of New Jersey. And she'll be talking to us about some of the society's shoreline projects on the Delaware Bay shoreline. So with that, Quinn, take it away. Looks
Thanks,
great.
Danielle. Thanks. Yeah, so my name is Quinn, and I'm the Habitat Restoration Coordinator for the Littoral Society's Delaware Bayshore office. I'm going to be talking today about some of the different projects that we've been doing regarding our intertidal reefs, transitioning from Delaware Bay up to Forked River and then back down to Delaware Bay, and just some of the different strategies that we have done over the last 10 years. So our problem that we started with was Hurricane Sandy. So most of the beaches on the Delaware Bay side that were critical for horseshoe crab and shorebird habitat were almost completely wiped of sand. And so we received some emergency funding and permits from state and federal agencies to put sand on the beach. And this, project was really geared towards the ecological uplift of horseshoe crabs and migratory shorebirds. And so that's kind of what started our habitat restoration in Delaware Bay. And this was back in 2013, and the sand was put on the beach right before horseshoe crab spawning. And, you can see the picture at the bottom right of like horseshoe crabs showing up just as we were finishing up our restoration. But sand moves. So, we were trying to come up with some ways of keeping that sand on the beach and creating a longer lifespan of those projects. So we started to install these low-profile shell bag reefs, and these are the typical reefs that we have been installing in the Delaware Bay. And they consist of these polyethylene shell bags that most restoration practitioners have been using. We did try some potato waste bags and biodegradable bags, but they weren't really successful. But these consist of a whole whelk shell that we get from a local supplier. And this is the general construction of our low profile shell bag reefs. We have these 5x10 reef blocks with 5-foot gaps to allow for water passage and also horseshoe crab movement through that area as well. There's a 60-foot gap, and then it's about 200 linear feet long. So the permits that were needed for this are the state GP24 and then the Army Corps nationwide 27 and 54 for these. So after a few months of installing the shell bags, this is typically what a whelk shell looks like. So you can see some young oyster growth, some anemones, and other encrusting organisms on the shell. After about 4 years, this is what a reef block typically looks like. You can see some of that polyethylene shell bag coming through, but most of the shell bags are glued together with this really great oyster growth, barnacles. We have some rib mussels. And, you know, a lot of the interstitial space where those shell bags can start to lock together, and the oyster growth will also lock together as well. We've done a lot of monitoring on these shell bags and beach restoration projects that we've been doing over the years. And all of that is to help inform future strategies for our beach restoration work. You know, one of the concerns that we have in Delaware Bay is horseshoe crab impingement. And so we've done several studies over the years at our different shell bag reefs and even some of our other structures, just to make sure that we're not causing any impingement issues. We look at shorebird interaction. We do some biodiversity assessments to see what kind of habitat we're creating. And then we're on the physical side of things. We look at wave attenuation, sand accretion, and reef elevation. And Stockton University's Coastal Research Center helps with more of those physical monitoring aspects of these projects. I really love this drone image that was taken in 2020 at Cooks. And so the arrows are pointing to the intertidal reefs that we built at Cooks. And you can see that it's keeping a lot of that sand in place just inshore of those reefs. And then we have these really great shoals on either side. And those shoals are great horseshoe crab spawning habitat because it's nice and shallow and calm. But because it's such a dynamic system, that sand moves and unearths eggs relatively easy, which creates, you know, optimal foraging habitat for migratory shorebirds. So taking what we've learned from those low-profile shell bag reefs, we moved up to Forked River, where it's some habitat, ecological uplift restoration, but we're also concerned about the resiliency of the community here. You can see the severe erosion that's been happening, you know, as early as pictured as 1995. So we had a pilot project where we looked at oyster pens versus these HESCO units. And through that pilot study, it turns out that the HESCOs is what we preferred. You know, there's very little movement or settling as compared to the pens. We need less shell, so it becomes more cost effective. There's a better volunteer component for this as well. And we can design the HESCOs to more how we want them. And so you'll see that we have the same kind of sawtooth pattern with these 5-foot gaps that we were using for the shell bag reefs in Delaware Bay. And we mirrored that for the installation of the HESCO units as well up in Forked River. And that's just an aerial of what they look like along Forked River. And so taking what we learned in those two locations, we now move back down to Delaware Bay into the Morris River. And so in Morris River, we have this peninsula called Basket Flats that's protecting essentially all of these upland communities from direct ocean swells. This is a much higher energy environment than what we have been previously working in. So we know that these low profile shell bag reefs are just not going to cut it here. And so after several years of meeting with technical experts and stakeholders, we ended up coming up with the design of these rock hybrid breakwaters. So the next phase of this is to install coir logs behind the rock breakwaters, plant some spartina, and then also put some oyster shell. And that's all just going to protect this eroding marsh behind those breakwaters. And so with those 3 projects, this is going to inform our projects that we have planned for the future. And one of those is Fortescue, also in Delaware Bay. And you'll see on this design, we have a couple of different breakwaters that we want to install here. So on the left, we have our more typical low profile shellbag reefs. Again, the 200 linear feet with 5-foot gaps, about 50 feet between the 2 reef segments. And then to the right, we have more of the rock hybrid breakwater that we've just installed in Morris River, sitting on a tensar mat. And so the lessons learned that's providing future considerations for our future projects, what is it that we want these breakwaters to do? Are we looking more to create habitat or keep the sand in the system? What kind of energy is the environment? Those, like I said, those low profile shellbag reefs are not really going to work in these high energy environments. So maybe we have to have a hybrid of all of these different breakwater types. What material can we use? What kind of tie downs are we looking at? Can we use alternative materials to the plastic shell bags? What kind of substrate are we looking at? We learned that at some of these locations, the substrate is really soft. And so we have to have some kind of geofabric or a marine mattress to minimize any settling that's going to happen. And how can we incorporate a living component? We don't want to just pile rock in the bay and walk away. So, can we install coir logs or a place shell on the leeward side of these breakwaters? And, one of the biggest aspects of our restoration work is community involvement. And so we want to make sure that there's some kind of way that the community can get directly involved in the project. Are there any concerns for ice or SAV, horseshoe crabs, shorebirds, and also what kind of permits are needed? And so, over doing the work for the last 10 years, we have actually been able to leverage a lot of this into regional permits for both the state and the federal level. And so having those permits in hand makes us shovel ready when we go to find funding for future projects as well. And I'm happy to take a question, or feel free to email me questions as well.
Thank you so much, Quinn. That was a great summary of all the Living Shorelines work you guys are doing. We have time for a question or two if someone wants to raise their hand or just come off mute. Okay, we'll wait till our question and answer session. Allison, do you want to see if we can hear you now?
Hello.
Yes, perfect. Awesome. All right, I'm going to introduce Allison really quickly.
This hasn't happened to me before, so.
I'm so sorry, but I'm glad we got it figured out. Allison Rogerson is an environmental scientist with the Delaware Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control, Division of Watershed Stewardship, Watershed Assessment, and Management section in Dover, Delaware. She's also the co-chair for the Delaware Living Shorelines Committee, who has a lot of great resources and a great website if anyone wants more information on living shorelines. And she's also the lead scientist for the Wetland Monitoring and Assessment program. Allison helps both groups promote living shorelines to address coastal issues through research, education, and demonstration. And she's here to talk to us about the Lewis Canal and maybe a little bit of information on the tactics document that the Delaware Living Shorelines Committee put together. So with that, I'll let Allison take it away. Thanks so much, Allison.
Thank you, Danielle. Thank you for your patience. So I wanted to give a case study example today of Lewis Canal in Delaware. As Kurt's on here, this was a partnership, a cooperative effort, and it was pretty successful. So I wanted to share it with you. This project, the problem, what are we looking at? So this has a long story, a little bit of a history. So on the map on the right, you'll see that the shoreline that we're looking at from up above on the right-hand side, the green line, that's actually a 2014 Living Shoreline project that we installed with the Partnership for the Delaware Estuary. And it was very successful, The part on the left hand was our control. And the pink line used to be the shoreline in 2014. Then it went back to the red line. Then it calved off in the hash line in 2020. And so we're here monitoring, and we're literally seeing our monitoring plots for this control site falling in. And we're like, wow, this is really a mess. We'd love to do something here because this just continues to erode away. And some of the pictures you see there was cusping, just really steep, jagged wetland edge, and huge clumps of plants falling off, and even that large calving area just slumping down. So, you can see from the table from our monitoring from 2014 when we installed the original, that and up until 2018, we were doing intensive monitoring, that we saw that treatment, we were able to document a gain of 73 meters squared of wetland, but at the same time, we lost almost 50 square meters in our control area. And that's what led us to this project, which we call the Lewis Canal extension, because it's an extension of the original. So we partnered up, actually, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Coastal Program came to us and said, hey, we have some funding. Would you be interested in a project? And we had this one on our mind. And so the three of us got together, and our goals for this were just to stop that shoreline erosion, the wetlands that were lost, which would enhance the habitat function there and also improve water quality. And we're always interested in more examples. So having an educational demonstration was important for us too. The design we came up with, kind of going off of some of the notes that Kurt made about just, the short longevity of core logs, we decided to change things up and try to have a design that was really oyster shell based. So this design has 5 oyster shell pyramid segments that are all lined up there, and that would be out to replace the original, like the pre-existing shoreline. So they're lined up. They have the pyramid. You can see the schematic over there on the right. So that's about 9 bags total in a pyramid. They're held in with stakes, wooden stakes, and the ends of each of these segments is flared on opposite ends so that they overlap. There's a lot of predominant wind coming down from the right to the left in this photo, coming down the canal. Also a lot of wind and some boat wake as well. So we wanted to make sure those openings were really protected. And then you see there are 5 brown, well, there are 6, but we installed 5 core logs kind of as interior bafflings to help just kind of make it a tiered progression of sediment to reach our goal, our target elevation. And you can see the blue marks there. We had a lot of drainage paths that were like surface paths we had to mind. So we had to leave those openings for drainage. Just naturally, we wanted things to, breathe, but then also we had those drainage flows that we really had to account for. So each of those segments are all tiny bit different, but they're about 15 or so meters, and each one took about 250 shell bags. So a lot of recycled oyster shell bags that went into this, but a pretty simple design overall, just a ton of oyster shells and then some interior core logs. And that was basically it, pretty simple. For permitting, we were able on the state level to use the Living Shoreline Stabilization Statewide Activity Approval, SAA, which is basically like the state version of a nationwide permit, simpler, streamlined, a little bit faster, because we met some of those requirements in length and maintaining connection from aquatic to upland habitat and having living components and enhancing ecological functions. And it does allow for maintenance, which is nice to come back in without having to amend. And then on the federal side, we use the nationwide permit 54 for living shorelines, some of the same requirements for that. We had there weren't a ton of challenges with this project other than just getting the permits in. So we ideally wanted to, install by April, that's the sweet time in the spring. We didn't get permits until like the middle of June. So we installed the next week. So that was a little bit of a challenge. And then it wasn't really a challenge, but we were required to put up signs that discouraged harvesting and consuming shellfish, just because there was such a big component of shellfish in this project. That was a requirement, not a big deal. We were lucky to be able to have partnership for the Delaware Estuary with their source of recycled shell, because it took 1,200 shell bags. So, that can be a limiting factor in projects, but we were lucky to have them as a source. The installation was one day, one hot, stinking, humid day, and all by hand. As Kurt mentioned, sometimes you have these physical limitations We could have come in by water, but we were really close to like a parking lot, and there's a ball field there, would have limited any kind of mechanical arms reaching in. But we just use like the bucket brigade for like all 1,200 shell bags and the core logs, and just hammered them all the stakes in ourselves. So just to get a sense of the size of this is a before and after of the whole thing. So definitely stepping that way out. And then the interior core logs you see, which we kind of shored up at the ends and in the middle. If you can see my cursor, the ends and in the middle with some oyster shell bags as well, just to kind of bump them up. And we left it alone. That was in June. And we've been really happy. We knew that there were a lot of existing oyster shell colonies here. That was something we were working off of, and that's based on our previous experience with the original project in 2014. We knew there were oyster colonies here, reefs and beds. So we knew that, you know, this was a good opportunity to recruit more and have more colonized. And we also knew there's a lot of suspended sediment in this waterway in the canal, and that would we expected just natural passive deposition of sediment inside of these shell structures to build up and, you know, rebuild to the desired elevation so that we could establish a Spartina, extend that Spartina platform all the way out to the shells. For monitoring, you know, we're doing a lot because, well, that's what we love to do, and we want to really document the benefits here. So we're tracking horizontal shoreline position, the vertical elevation. We're looking at bearing capacity just to see how long does it take before the new sediment that settles in, how long does it take before it becomes firm. Just always checking on the integrity of the materials. If we have a harsh winter ever again, and we have ice issues in the canal, we want to be, you know, cognizant of that. Definitely trying to monitor and track the colonization of shellfish for the water quality benefits and the habitat component. So going in and doing not only quarter square meter quadrat surface counts on the bags, but then also pulling whole bags, completely dissecting them and counting every single spat, like you can see on that shell picture on the bottom left. And we found that, so we installed it in June, we went back in October. And so after only 4 months, we were finding 50 to up to 175 oyster shells like spat per bag after only a handful of months. So really amazing response there. And then we'll also be monitoring vegetation in terms of blade height and veg density and percent cover and species. You know, the higher plots are kind of not really changing, but the low that are out into the new wetlands are going to be developing as this matures. This was just completed in June of 2021, so it's still very young. You can see the picture on the right shows our monitoring plots. So the OG, the three transects in pink in our original project with 5 plots deep from waterward to landward, and then another three transects in our extension with 5 plots on each. And then in green, we have the shoreline position. So we're basically going around, we're RTKing every shellfish structure to see if it's settling. Is it, you know, going too deep? Is it not where the elevation that we want? The design that we created has the shells exposed at low tide and submerged at high tide. So we want to, again, and that's another point to integrity of materials, is just how is it settling down over time. And I will say that we're super impressed. The picture in the middle there is just a side shot of the whole thing after, I think that's the first summer back. So the passive accretion of sediment has already built up to the back of the shell bags. So if we go back to this picture, these shell bags, we've now built all the way up to the top of them. You can't even see the core logs anymore. So we knew there's a lot of sediment here, but I never cease to be amazed at how quickly it accretes here, which is great. And then in terms of, we haven't really had to do adaptive management post-construction work. Like I said, we were required to put up the one shellfish sign to discourage harvesting and consumption. We put up a living shoreline project sign to let people know what they're looking at and kind of promote just some basic information about why living shorelines are good, what it's providing, and who did this. We're keeping an eye on plants, where I'm already starting to see, I was down there a month ago for the living shoreline tour, some Spartina creeping in from the side. So we're thinking that this won't have to be planted. It will, you know, plants will come in on their own. And we're being mindful of the drainage because we want to make sure that those surface flows that we mentioned on the design are functioning. They're not scouring out, and they are draining and not pooling behind. And so far, they're working perfectly. So we're really happy with that as well. Lessons learned. This cooperative effort has been really successful. All of us coming together with funding and resources and expertise and manpower has been great. We did it all ourselves. We're happy with just being able to use the oyster shell bags to kind of compare to core logs and just the longevity of them. It is unfortunate we have to use the plastic bags. There isn't really an alternative at this time. And we're happy about having, we're definitely confirming that having nearby shellfish is so helpful into recruiting new shellfish, new oysters, and always grateful for the gift of sediment. There's that natural accretion that happens on its own. It's not sand material. It's not so sterile. And I think that really helps for vegetation recruitment. And I'm excited about the shellfish monitoring that we're doing. In the picture on the right there, you can see those tiny little quarter meter squared quadrats just laid over the shell bags. So just getting creative and really being able to quantify shellfish recruitment, because that turns into being able to really quantify and document water quality benefits, which is so important, for ecological stake, but also for justification and reporting and even funding standpoint. So a lot of good things going on here. And you can see more about this project on Delaware Living Shorelines webpage. I think those are all the details that I wanted to hit about that case study. I can take questions now before I switch gears.
Questions for Allison? The sediment that was accumulating behind those oyster bags, awesome, by the way, really great visual. Do you think that's coming from the water or from erosion from the upland?
No, not from erosion. It's definitely coming from the water. Just,
Wow.
tidal coming in and out. And that was with the same accretion that we experienced with the original project. So that was a little bit expected, but I tell you, it never ceases to amaze me.
Yeah, really impressive. Cool.
Successful
Awesome.
project. We're going to continue to monitor this for a few years. We'll go back, watch the vegetation and the shellfish recruitment and integrity and things like that. So we'll be there for a few more years.
Great. I want to come see it. I'm really excited to hear about this next part. Yeah, please tell us what you've been working on.
So I wanted to give a little preview of a new product coming out from the Living Shorelines Committee. This is a product of two of our subcommittees, standard operating procedures and the design and engineering subcommittees have come together to create these techniques and applications of living shorelines in Delaware. So I'm not an author on this. I contributed in some little parts, but I really can't take credit for this. This is just a preview of it. It is just about out on the shelves. It's in its very last editing. You know how we are. Just edit, and scientists, we just like to tweak things and keep going forever. So almost out on the shelves. But the goal of this project, this document, is to help folks, just start from the right frame of mind, just defining your project goals for a living shoreline, then using those goals to select the appropriate design elements to meet your goals, and then selecting your materials for design elements. And it's not too prescriptive. It's really meant to help you build to meet your project goals. And you're going to see the word appropriate a lot, because it's really encouraging appropriate designs using appropriate materials so that you have a successful project. There's no cookie cutter recipes in living shorelines. They all need to be site specific, designed to whatever conditions and goals you have. So it's really just giving you all the pieces that you can put together based on our best, the best available information we have. And it's meant to be the next step after you do a site evaluation and use the feasibility model. This would come next. And it fits into this flow chart of living shoreline development that the Living Shorelines Committee has come up with. And here's a shot of that. So we tried to just say, what's the flow? People walking into this that aren't familiar with what comes first. You start in the very beginning. Why would you do this? All the way to it's already installed and you're monitoring it. We already have 2 custom documents, site evaluation where you see the yellow star, and then also an adaptive management. And this is fitting in right where that red arrow is for site design. So trying to fill in some of the gaps. of just making resources that are really useful for people in Delaware and the Mid-Atlantic to use to help along appropriate and therefore successful living shoreline projects. And you can find this on the Delaware Living Shorelines webpage. So section 1, we're reviewing the definition of living shorelines, hybrid, conventional, what makes them up. And then also just describing the goals again, because it's really important as just a starting off point. Where are you coming from? What are you doing this for? Instead of just running in and band-aiding something, what's your real goal? Shoreline position, habitat enhancement, water quality, maybe all of them, that's okay. Section 2 goes into these common design elements. And for every design element, and there are 12 maybe, it's going to give you uses, common materials in that design element, your goal alignment, so which one is appropriate for that application, some of the ecological outcomes if you apply this appropriately, and then some of the limitations, considerations. And this was hard to kind of label and organize, but it's just like, all of our lessons learned put together into one sort of section. So every design element comes with all of these components. The list of all of the design elements, okay, there are 12, there are like 8, but just everything from in the water to, offshore attenuating structures, all the way to graded slopes. So everything from in the water to the up on the shore, any kind of component you can think of for design elements are included in here with all those considerations I just mentioned. And then what comes next is the common materials that are used in living shorelines. So we have all the different things you could think of. Just passive nourishment, putting in plants, core fiber material, shells, any kind of prefab structures, wood and rock. And then for each of those materials, this is a nice feature if you're new and you're not sure if something's right. This is, again, trying to steer you in the right direction of having appropriate material for every design element, is laying out these goals of energy attenuation, positioning, drainage, and habitat, and then rating every material for whether they're likely or unlikely to be appropriate. Not giving you a full answer. We're not going to give you a recipe, but we're going to kind of guide you. So as an example, here are 2. So passive nourishment, probably it's going to be okay for attenuation. It's going to be great for habitat. And it's going to really help you with that positioning, building up, passively building up material is going to help you with your positioning for sure. On the other hand, something like rocks is going to be maybe not the best selection for if you want to really focus on habitat components. So every material has this little colored rating that goes along with it to kind of give you a sense of, okay, well, remember your goal, this particular material may be the best, it may not be. So, think carefully through your selection as you incorporate them into your design elements. And then last but not least, we have some case studies. So there are 7 examples from around Delaware that are showing different energies and design elements and all different materials. So each of them follow a similar template. I just put one up here for the Lewis ball field since this is the one I just showed everyone. So all of them include the project details, goals, some of the considerations and, existing conditions that were out there, some photos before and after, who was involved in it. And then, there we go. The second and third pages just have more details about what went into it, permitting, construction, and then monitoring one to make sure we hit on what are we looking at and how, and what are we finding and what are our lessons learned. So there are 7 of these. They're already up online. You can view them. So hopefully they're not technical. They're 3 pages, a lot of information in each of these, and they're streamlined to match. And that's really an appendix to the guide, to the techniques and applications guide. We didn't want to attach it and make it too bulky, but we feel like it's really helpful. We've just given you all these design elements. We've given you all these materials, these considerations, and hey, here are some examples of where we put them together and they worked, so you can see. So, hopefully kind of showing you how they can come together. And that is it. That's the preview.
That is awesome. Do you know when that will be released?
As soon as we can stop editing it. Seal it.
Gotcha. Well, we will be waiting with bated breath. And, I try to keep a list of parking lot items for this group to work on. And maybe something that could come out of this webinar is a case studies document similar to what you guys did, but do it for New Jersey. We could bring a lot of what you do on the Living Shorelines Committee up here to our state. We're a little bit behind. We started our projects a little bit later than I think you guys did in Delaware. So this is why we're here. So thank you so much, Allison. Really appreciate you sharing all that information with us.
Thank you.
Great. Our next speaker is from New Jersey. We have Kira. She's a principal fisheries biologist with New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, and she's sharing her Sedge Island Natural Resource Education, a Living Shoreline pilot project with us. I'm really interested to hear about this project. So with that, Kira, take it away.
Great, thanks, Danielle. All right, so I'm going to make sure I get this order of operations correct. All right, so okay, awesome. A number of years ago, we worked on the Sedge Island Natural Resource Education Center. This was a collaborative effort between New Jersey DEP, Partnership for the Delaware Estuary, and the Barnegat Bay Partnership. This is the after photo, but we'll go through the process of how we got to this point and where we are now. So the problem is that the education center is located on a bay island in Barnegat Bay near the inlet. It's just off of Island Beach State Park. It is a state-owned fish and wildlife property for the purposes of outdoor marine education. And you can see this is an overhead aerial photo of the site. It's an old caretaker's house on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side is an old hunting lodge that was deeded to the state a number of years ago. Essentially, the problem is that we are experiencing shoreline erosion, significantly so, underneath the caretaker's house that's on the right side of the property. It was especially worsened by the loss of dock structures during Superstorm Sandy that were previously serving as wave attenuation. There's mowing and maintenance of the upper lawn areas that you can see in the photo there before it goes to the natural wetland species. And it's a high velocity and dynamic area. Can kind of see where that tide goes in and out. We have some real deep waters right in front of the one dock area, and you can see where it starts to shoal on either side of that. So that was essentially what sparked the interest in working on this particular property. So we had three main objectives. The first one started with arresting the erosion underneath the caretaker's house and along that adjacent shoreline. The second was to try to accrete that sediment in order to rebuild the island and wetland to the best ability possible. And then thirdly, that sort of came at a later point in time when I joined into the project, was to test the viability of using all biodegradable materials. So one of the things that's, there's a lot going on in this slide, but this was a multi-year effort and a multi-partner collaborative effort that sort of underwent a couple of different iterations. So before I was directly involved in the project, because Sedge Island is sort of overseen by another entity within Fish and Wildlife, there was a conceptual design by Partnership for the Delaware Estuary. Thanks, Josh Moody, for that one. He did a real great job. And the Barnegat Bay Partnership as well, who collected RTK data to really survey the shoreline and understand what the existing conditions were. There was use of the Restoration Explorer tool to try to understand the conditions. And then there was desktop analysis and a report with construction and material recommendations that was put together by Josh Moody and his crew at Delaware Estuary. That was submitted for design and it was permitted, which I'll go over in the next slide. But ultimately, for a number of reasons, the implementation didn't advance at that particular time. In 2019, when I got involved, we were able to more earnestly have a push to get the project through, but we did include some design changes to all biodegradable materials as part of that third experiment. So this just gives you a list of the types of things that we used. We used Rolenka brand coir fibers and fiber bags, logs, and matting. So the bags you can see we stuffed with whelk, surf clam, and dirt. A lot of dirt actually went into those bags. And one of our experiments was to try to make the core logs heavier and denser. And we did that by rolling them in the fiber matting that is also produced by that same company, and then tying it together with twine. And it definitely did make them heavier. It required a number of people to be able to carry those things out into the water. For permitting, again, we had a great contribution of a material report to submit for a DEP general permit 24 that comes from the Division of Land Use Protection, or excuse me, they've changed names a couple of times, but it's the regulatory arm of the department. A GP24 is for habitat creation and living shorelines. It was issued in 2017, along with an Army Corps nationwide 13 permit for bank stabilization that was issued in 2018, but again, it was not constructed at that time. Later on, we revised the design ever so slightly, submitted for a modification to the permits to move forward with that. And all of our permit applications included site photos, site plans, existing conditions, conceptual designs, and a compliance statement. So we had to go through all of the same hurdles, shall we say, and steps as anybody would have to, even though we were a state agency applying through a state agency. We were able to receive post-Sandy FEMA funding for this, and an aquaculture education federal grant also helped pay for it. And the person who was in charge of that estimates that the materials were about $10,000 to $15,000 in total. So implementation was a one-day event, very similar to the presentation that we just heard, although it was definitely a lengthy preparation for one-day installation. Ordering the materials, getting them out to the island. So everything had to be placed on vessels and shuttled out to the island and stored in advance. Filling of the shell bags was definitely facilitated by a lot of volunteers as well as our own staff, and that took place over probably a couple of weeks as staff and volunteers were able to work on the shell pile. The shell was dumped over at Island Beach State Park. The bags were filled over there and then boated over to the island. One of the big things we ran into was storage. Tarp storage was definitely critical to try to reduce the water logging of the materials in advance of us having to move them around on site. But we did a single day installation in June of 2019. Low with the rising tide, we had about 25 people. It was a really great help. And it was all of our staff folks from DEP, Partnership for Delaware Estuary, and Barnegat Bay Partnership. These are just a couple of photos of the installation at the time. So monitoring success. So we do not have nearly as much empirical information about this as I would like to. We started out pretty strong in that department, and then for a number of reasons that has sort of waned over time. There were RTK visits over time to track that elevation change. Unfortunately, that wasn't able to continue. We also tried for some minnow trap data. So we were looking for essentially the tide pool effects that these areas were creating, and we definitely saw positive effects that way. But you'll see over time, we couldn't have continued that minnow trap data because essentially we lost those tide pools. But one of the things that we were able to keep up successfully with is drone footage on a year after year basis, a couple of different times of year and a couple of different tidal cycles. So those drone footage maps have been georeferenced, and this just shows you two of them over time and not all of the interim, but the June 18th, 2019 is the immediately after installation photo, and you can see the June 6th of 2022 is the status now. They are at very slightly different tidal cycles. So one of the things that I have on my list to do is to go back through and really understand the different tide cycles and things like that for each of the photos to better understand what we're really looking at in this time series. But you can see there's been a drastic change. Pretty much all of the core logs were gone, and a lot of the shell bags are no longer visible. But there's a couple of reasons for that. So one of the things that we did for adaptive management was to place remaining shell bags and core logs in empty spaces along the wetland edges. So in December of 2019, we went back out. We saw a lot of things had floated away or been blown out. So that was just a matter of a 6-month time window. We did have some extra materials from the installation day. So we basically just went back in and plugged those holes to the best of our ability. In August of 2022, we actually put out an experimental beach cellulose bag with cultureless oyster seeds to see if that has different or better structural integrity than the core fiber bags. And we have not yet been out to see if those have survived. And essentially, we plan to continue the annual orthomosaic imagery and site visits for comparison. So a lot of our monitoring has been based upon photograph interpretation, qualitative evaluation, and again, these aerial photography visits. And then certainly we plan to reevaluate for new treatment with hard structure because as you can see this photo here, you can still see a lot of the materials, but when you go out there now in the next photos, you won't see nearly as many of them. So the biggest lessons learned. So Josh was right about the hard structure. So I appreciated that he was flexible on my determination to see if the soft structures at this site would be successful. But he was right that the hard structure definitely would have had a little bit more integrity over time. But we learned a lot of really cool things because where it worked, where it didn't. So you can see in the top photo from June of 2019, that was also the day of installation. You can see a couple of places where we didn't have wetland growth or wetland species whatsoever. And in August of 2022, we did have growth there. Whether or not that can be directly attributed to the treatment and the work that we put at the island, unsure, but at least it is changing over time. And I would like to think that at least a little bit of our work helped with that. In particular, in that right-hand corner where you see the grass that's encroaching across the front of the deck there, we did put a lot of effort into putting shell bags and core logs in there over time. And those are some of the places where we plugged holes when we were able to. So we could really see that sort of changing. You can see all of the spikes as well, where we had the logs, and the logs are just completely gone. Interestingly enough, though, we actually do have a fair amount of success with the shell bags remaining in place. And the one thing I want to say before I forget is that one of our objectives, or rather, our objective with the shell bag and the use of the biodegradable material was not necessarily to recruit oysters or to provide a reef environment, but rather to serve as a place where sediment would accrete and we could get vegetation to grow through. So we had a slightly different objective than what's typically used with shell bags, which is obviously designed for shellfish or other reef organism settlement. So the lower left-hand picture, you actually see, so there's a bag under there. There is a core fiber bag with shell that's underneath there, and there are a couple of wetland plants that are growing out of it, and that thing is buried in. It's not going anywhere. So that was actually really cool. One of the other things that we learned was that our tide pool effect was great at first, except when the high tides and the summer comes around and you get those dense macroalgae blooms, and then it gets very smelly. If you are in a location where people are not likely to be very often, it's not such a big deal, but because this was an education center and there were groups of students and other folks from the community involved in programs on a daily or weekly basis, it did become a bit of a problem. So that's something to consider for the future. These are just another couple of photos over time. So some of the bags I had to dig for. So some of them are covered by dry rack that's come up over time, but those are grasses that are growing out of the shell bags, and you can see them over time. And even if there isn't any growth necessarily, some of them are still sort of cemented in there, and they're creating, they are trapping sediment. A lot of those whelk shells that you see loose, those seem to be digging in as well, because when they're whole whelk shells like that, you know, that sediment goes into the side and kind of hunkers in really nicely. The crate was there as an experiment from a student that was out at Sedge Island, so I was not involved in that part. But it is interesting to see what the shoreline looks like over time. And there's a lot more to be done, a lot more lessons, but it was a really great start for this project. And that's what I have.
Kira, thank you so much for sharing the successes and then the not so successes. I think that's super valuable, and I plan on doing something similar in a second. Any questions for Kira? Okay. Everyone wants to wait to ask questions during the open discussion, I guess. Thank you so much, Kira. And I guess I'll introduce myself. I'm Danielle McCulloch. I'm with the Delaware Bay Coastal Program. I was hoping Adriana would be able to present our Gandy's Beach project. We had a lot of lessons learned, so I thought it was really valuable to share them with you guys, but I'll be presenting our project. If you'll just bear with me for 1 second. Jesse, how does this look? Or anyone?
It's good, Danielle. It's just the primary page.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So I'll be talking about Gandy's Beach. It was one of the first big living shoreline projects in New Jersey. It happened after Hurricane Sandy, a large partnership. It was a partnership between the Nature Conservancy and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Does this advance the next slide for you all?
Yes.
Okay, great. So this is where we're talking about. It's in Delaware Bay, but it's on the New Jersey shore. It's the Nature Conservancy's preserve. And this area gets a ton of very dynamic energy. It was prime area to try some living shoreline tactics. And so the problem. First of all, lots of marsh edge loss here, up to 130 feet since 1939. Lots of sediment lost, 850,000 cubic yards of sediment lost between 1977 and 2014. So clearly an issue of erosion. But then U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service got involved because after Hurricane Sandy, we were losing a lot of the sand on the New Jersey Delaware Bay shoreline. And so we wanted to explore tactics that could help us tackle those issues. Gandy's Beach was a great area because it had lost a lot of sand, but it wasn't a shorebird foraging area. It wasn't a prime one. So it was kind of a low risk area to try some novel tactics. We had lots of objectives. At the beginning of the project, there were 4 main objectives are highlighted in bold, but as the project developed, we had some more objectives. And number 1 was to increase the constructability of living shorelines in New Jersey. So we wanted to find stable materials that would work in the energetic system of Gandy's Beach. We wanted something that could be volunteer built because we don't often have funding for these projects. So we wanted to use our volunteer force, and we wanted to learn the logistics of these types of projects. We also wanted to increase shoreline stabilization. Obviously, that's a primary concern. The 2 main concerns here were we wanted to reduce the marsh loss at Gandy's Beach, and we also wanted to accrete sediment, namely sand, that had been taken from the peat layer at Gandy's Beach. We also wanted to protect beach habitat, control erosion, attenuate waves, and increase or maintain the sediment elevation and vegetation extent. We also wanted to increase the ecological uplift of the area. So we wanted to use a material that would recruit and increase oysters and increase nectin abundance and diversity. So trying to find some sort of reef material that could meet those goals. But we also want to make sure that whatever we implemented was going to facilitate natural processes and allow the passage of horseshoe crabs so that they could spawn on the beach if sand was placed there and they could spawn there. And then because we had a large partnership and we had the great opportunity to find funding for 5 years of monitoring, that does not happen often with these living shoreline projects, we really wanted to use those data and advance restoration in living shoreline. So we created what Adriana likes to call a learning landscape here. We had the long-term monitoring, but we wanted to make sure that we would share results and transfer our lessons learned, which is one of the reasons I wanted to share this project with you guys today. So for the design, I said, this is a very energetic area, but we also had to deal with episodic ice. So we needed something that was going to be stable, that was going to be able to stand up to a 6-foot tidal range, ice, and the extreme energetics of the area. So core logs and vegetation and some of the softer tactics probably not going to cut it. So we looked at using these oyster castle structures. They're made of a specialized cement that creates a lot of interstitial space that allows oyster to attach and grow and create some of that interstitial space for other aquatic organisms. They're also great because they can be moved in individual pieces, which make them great for volunteer events. So we had 3,000 feet of shoreline that were treated, 28 oyster castle breakwaters total. And we had 3 sections of low relief shell bags that were kind of behind the oyster castles or were kind of adjacent to them to act as kind of an experiment to see how they would stand up to these energetics as well. And then we wanted to make sure that horseshoe crabs could pass through. So we had 5-foot gaps between all of the structures. And this is what an oyster castle breakwater looked like at right after construction. And then here you can see what the shell bag reefs look like after construction. This was the original design. I just wanted to say here that it was ocean construction and coastal construction company that designed this project using data from 2011. So this is a lesson that we learned, that you want to make sure that the data you're using to design your project factors in trajectories like sea level rise and is also up to date. That company is no longer in New Jersey, but if anyone has a contact for them, I'd love to get in touch with them and ask a few questions. But anyway, so we saw that the castles were great at recruiting oysters. The very first year, just great recruitment and great survivability. And here's a great aerial of the site after construction. You can see the oyster castle breakwaters that kind of fringe along here. Along the spine is our adaptive management project, which I'll get into in a second. For permitting, we got a nationwide permit from the Army Corps of Engineers, nationwide permit 27. We did have some seasonal restrictions for essential fish habitat. These were all intertidal structures, so some of the other essential fish habitat concerns didn't apply. But we also had the seasonal restriction for red knot from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as well. And they also wanted to make sure that we had those gaps in the structure so that horseshoe crabs could go through. We also needed to make sure that the crest height was below mean high water. So all structures needed to be submerged at high tides. We also got a tidelands lease. And at the time, there wasn't a New Jersey State General Permit 24, so we needed to get an individual permit for this project. This is how new it was. Implementation was a combination of getting a barge to bring out the materials and use a crane to place the pallets of materials at the beach. And then from there, it was a volunteer effort. So we used plywood, chain gangs, and created everything by hand. For monitoring, for biological monitoring, we looked at the extent of vegetation. We looked at nectin abundance and diversity. We looked at oyster recruitment and size, and we wanted to make sure that there was no horseshoe crab impingement. But we also wanted to look at the physical factors as well. So we did a site-wide topography, looked at the structural integrity of the breakwaters, and looked at wave energies and wave attenuation. We had a fantastic monitoring crew. It took a lot of people to collect all these data at this site. The Nature Conservancy looked at horseshoe crab impingement, but they also did photo point monitoring throughout the whole project to look at the change of the site over time. Stevens Institute of Technology's Coastal Engineering Research Group, they did all the wave attenuation and amplification monitoring. And then Partnership for the Delaware Estuary. I've heard Josh's name in just about every project. This is another one he was involved in. But PDE looked at vegetation, shoreline position of living shoreline structures, topographic changes, and elevation changes. And then Rutgers Haskin Shellfish Research Laboratory, they were the one that looked at the fish communities and how the oyster population responded to the breakwaters. So real quick, the results. We finally finished monitoring for this project. We will be compiling everything we've learned into a report for everyone. We want to share this information widely. So I'm just going to touch on some of the major takeaways from our partners' research, but if you have questions, you should reach out to them. They know their data a lot better than I do. So, but I'll try to do them justice and give you some of the highlights. Basically, for horseshoe crab impingement, it was negligible. We did see some male and female horseshoe crab that would become trapped or beneath the breakwater structures, but they were, the shape of the horseshoe crab, they were able to get out at higher tides. And so we didn't see a lot of mortality. It was very negligible. Wave attenuation, this was really interesting. It was greater when the oyster castles were emergent, which makes sense. If you have the tops of the castles, it's going to be like a wall for that water, right? So we had 20 to 40% attenuation when the castles were emergent at the lower tides. When the tides came up and the structures were submerged, they amplified energy. So we were seeing some increased erosion because these structures were submerged. So this was a major takeaway from John Miller's group. And I put Amy's graphs here at the bottom, but I could not tell you what they mean. She would be a much better person to explain them. But they had lots of pressure wave gauges out there. Laura Kerr's on the call. She could probably answer questions about their monitoring at the site. PDE did all the topographic information monitoring. Obviously, they saw that the shell bags that were placed in the intertidal areas became displaced. We also saw that all structure groups lost about 20 centimeters of elevation. That's not just the structures, that was also the sediment next to the structures. That's really interesting to me that it seems like the whole site, or at least the area where these structures were placed, decreased in elevation. And then we saw elevation losses outpaced any gains throughout the monitoring period, particularly in this, what we call the Tumblo area. It's this little peninsula area where no gains ever occurred. So I'm going to jump into our adaptive management. When we saw that that area wasn't accreting sediment, we thought that we needed to do some adaptive management. And then when we saw that the shell bags weren't staying in place, we needed to find a different function for those. So I'll start with the shell bags. The shell bags that were displaced, we started to place them around the eroding Spartina patches. And we found that the Spartina would accrete or kind of capture some of the sediment that was eroding on the site and then grow through the shell bags, keeping them in place. So they were really great in helping the Spartina and the vegetation extent kind of expand. So that was a great adaptive management tool. In the future, I would love to use a plastic alternative, maybe have that bag keep the shell in place short term, but once the Spartina starts to grow through the shell, have that bag kind of displaced. Something we can talk about in our discussion today. And then the adaptive management near this Tumblo, we found some funding and hired Sovereign Consulting to design something with leftover materials from the project that would help us control the losses of this Tumblo area, but we were also thinking that this protection would help some of the site at the southern end from some of the fetch that we were seeing. So this is what it looked like. It was a new configuration. I really liked this configuration. I like to describe it as cushiony rather than like reflecty, because it wasn't like a flat surface that was reflecting energy. There's a lot more interstitial space to capture sediment and to capture energy there. Because this project was implemented in 2020, we don't have as long monitoring period on this area, but we are looking. We did see a lot of sediment accretion immediately after the project, but the results of this, it might not have been to scale much like the rest of the project, which I'll talk about. Vegetation. In our previous meetings, we talked about PDE's watch tool, which helps us assess trajectories rather than just flat data. So looking at vegetation as like the extent of it as a trend rather than how much vegetation is there today, how much vegetation was there yesterday. It can help us predict how much vegetation there will be tomorrow. So the watch analysis confirmed that total vegetated area declined across the site. And then PDE split up the vegetation extent for the vegetation that was above the mean tide line and the vegetation that was below the mean tide line. And the vegetation that was above the mean tide line they found was increasing at higher elevations. And they predicted that if we wanted to maintain that, some sort of sediment enhancement would likely be needed to maintain that elevation for that vegetation to persist. I hope I'm saying that right, Josh. The vegetation below the mean tide line was still declining, however. Oysters. Oyster size was on the low end of size frequency distribution on natural oyster beds in the Delaware Bay, but overall the oyster population on these breakwaters mimicked the natural population. So when we saw great years for recruitment or great years of mortality, we kind of saw that reflected on these breakwaters. Overall, Rutgers stated that breakwaters can support a stable oyster population. They found that there was a greater percentage of young of the year oysters observed on the shell bags than the oyster castles. I wonder if that's a reflection of the oysters within the bags not being able to grow out like they can on the castles. That's something to ask them. But another interesting result was rib mussels were observed on all castle structures, sometimes at coverage densities of 95%. And we saw the rib mussel population really start to populate the castle structures as the project progressed. For nectin and fish, they did a lot of seining. They caught over 12,000 individuals from over 40 different taxa. We created reef habitat for a lot of recreationally and commercially important species, such as blue crabs, black drum, weakfish, summer flounder, northern kingfish, white perch, and striped bass. Rutgers also saw lots of juveniles and suggested that these reefs could be acting as important nursery habitat. There were no differences detected in nectin species richness or abundance between the Gandy's Beach Living Shoreline Project and the reference site tows. There was a control site that Rutgers was also sampling. But that could be a reflection of gear deficiencies. That's something Jenny has told me in the past. And then there was an increase in overall species richness and abundance at both the reef and reference site over time. I like to think that's because we added structure that maybe was drawing more fish to the area overall, but that's something that more monitoring would probably be needed to determine. So this just kind of summarizes everything that I stated in those slides. And so some major takeaways. Oyster castles are great. They can be used for, ice and dynamic conditions. They stay in place for the most part. They do recruit oysters and create fish habitat, and they can be creatively configured to meet your objectives. And they can also be built with volunteers, which is a great outreach opportunity, but also saves a lot of money. Shell bags are great as a secondary line of defense in these higher intertidal zones. They can add elevation. They can accrete sediment, like we saw with Kira's presentation and Allison's presentation. And for our project, they supported vegetation and mussels throughout the entire intertidal zone when they stayed in place. Some design considerations, some big takeaways for us. Reef crest height is really important. It seems like if you're not getting the height of your structures right, you could be creating more wave amplification and damaging your shoreline even more. So that's something maybe we could talk about, submergence versus emergent structures and how that factors into living shorelines. Amy Bredis from Stevens also said that width and proximity to the erosional lines are key. So you want to think about your width of structure, make sure it's knocking down the energy. You need it to be wide enough to do that. And then you want to make sure that it's the proper distance from where you're having your erosion rates. And then scale. I mean, so Gandy's is my background here. This is a big site. There's a lot of dynamic energy going on here. And these tiny breakwaters probably weren't scaled to meet the objectives of the project. So that's something for us to consider as we move forward with more work at Gandy's. And then we really need to quantify the value of reefs to fish. And that's not really going to happen with a single project. You kind of need active sampling gear, things like cameras and sonar and bioacoustics to really quantify fish that are utilizing the reefs, and then couple that with the passive gear like the nets. and do that at a multi-site, big scale. I'm hoping this group can help us come up with like a research proposal to kind of look at that. It's hard to do that with just one project, but Rutgers did a great job figuring out what was going on at Gandy's Beach. And then because we had volunteers build our structures, some of them weren't exactly built to spec. So it's really important that you have a coastal engineer provide oversight during implementation for a project like this. Maybe not a core log project or a shell bag project, but a project where you're putting in a big reef structure. You definitely want a coastal engineer on site. And then PDE suggested this, that it's important to implement multiple materials or reef types at different zones of the site. So when we saw like Allison's project, she had the shell bags as that first line of defense and then the core logs behind that. That's kind of the idea, I think. So we want to make sure that those materials are relative to tide and meet the wave attenuation and living reef goals of your project as well. And then we want to consider tidal dynamics. I didn't mention this, but there was a lot of water that was coming off of the marsh and the beach behind the project that also may have been amplifying energies and erosion. So that's something we really need to consider when we're putting a line of defense. You know, don't just think about what's in front of it or bayward side of it. You need to think about the habitat behind it as well. And ribbed mussels were the hero of this story. We should consider them for more living shoreline projects. So I'm going to end with this. My two main points that I hope you all take away from this is, for high energy sites like the ones we see in Delaware Bay, we really need to look at erosion trajectories and sea level rise trajectories and use those in our planning and design. We can't plan for today anymore. We need to start planning for tomorrow if we want to meet our objectives. And then I can't stress enough the value of sharing your successes, great, but also the value of sharing what didn't work so well. That's how we learn. That's how we advance our community of practice. I have a great team here for Gandy's Beach, and everyone is on the same page, transparency. Let everyone know what we're seeing. Make sure that we're dispersing this information, that we're sending out these reports, that we're publishing this information so that you all can think about your projects and take something away from what we've learned. So with that, I just want to thank our huge team and the huge effort that happened at Gandy's. It would not have been possible without Hurricane Sandy funding. That 5 years of monitoring is so rare. That's why I want this group to think about how can we get monitoring proposals for just monitoring for 5 years and link that with some of these coastal restoration projects. Gandy's is kind of a great framework for thinking about that. So with that, I'll stop sharing and stop talking. Okay, so now I want to open it up. If speakers could turn on their cameras, we'll have a quick, or not quick, however long it takes, a question and answer session. And at our last meeting, CHARRM, you were so quiet. I know lots of you work on Living Shorelines projects or have lots of questions. So I'm not asking questions today. I'm going to rely on you guys to ask some questions of our panel. You can raise your hand or just come off mute. Jonathan.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Great. I actually had a question for you, Danielle, about that that last project. I thought it was really interesting to hear about all the adaptive management work you guys have been doing there. I think it's really interesting. Not something I see every day on projects down here in the Chesapeake Bay. I was wondering if, so you mentioned something about the oyster castle structures that were maybe slightly below mean high water, the ones that were slightly higher being better at attenuating waves, and those were slightly lower, you know, maybe potentially even exacerbating wave energies. When my impression from your presentation was maybe those findings were available, and then you went and did the sort of, I think you described it as like a cushion type arrangement at the Tombolo feature. What were the heights set, I guess, for those castle pyramids or whatever you want to call them? And did you use the findings from that wave analysis study to actually set the heights a little bit higher? Or I'm really interested in those features. I think they look great from a habitat standpoint. I just wondering how they function from a wave energy attenuation standpoint. And if there was some consideration of changing the height there after your initial evaluation.
That's a great question. So the site sees a 6-foot tidal flux, right? Most of the structures were about 4 to 5 feet in height. I need to look. The breakwater structures. Those were the structures that Stevens conducted wave attenuation monitoring. Don't want to call out my partner who might be on the call, but I don't think that they placed wave gauges in there's Laura. I don't think they placed wave gauges on the adaptive management portion, which was designed before we got the results from Stevens. I also think it was a permitting restriction. We were not allowed to have structures that were emergent at all tide cycles. So that was a permitting restriction. But yeah, did that answer your question, Jonathan?
Yeah, it did. I was trying to get a handle on the timing there for that adaptive management piece. I guess, can I follow up and ask, was the permitting restriction was that a Coast Guard thing? It's like a visibility, like a navigational hazard, do you know? I feel like that's one of the things we run into in trying to get reefs, more reef-like structures used as wave attenuation features. Usually where people are kind of driven to either build them really, really, really tall or below mean high, and it's hard to get them in kind of that sweet spot where they you may want them to be. And I think it's mostly a Coast Guard concern. Was that the case here? You don't know?
No, I think it was, sorry to put my good friend Jessie, this is before her time, but I think it was a NMFS restriction. And I think it was because if you built a structure that was emergent at all tide cycles, then it's no longer intertidal habitat. So it's a habitat conversion issue, is my understanding. Meaning
they're not like the crest is not intertidal, but the rest of the structure is. Okay, that makes sense. If you want to call it a reef, I guess it's a question of whether or not it's a reef structure or a wave attenuation feature. And here it's kind of doing both things, I guess. Not to put you under the bus, Jessie, but thanks. That was appreciate the answers.
Neither Jessie nor I were a part of those permitting conversations. They were before both of our time. But I think that's my understanding. And if Jessie wants to chime in, or Laura, please.
Yeah, no, it's kind of what I assumed, just from hearing from it. But yeah, I know that was definitely before my time, but I'm going to assume that's probably what it was. But I think having this additional information for future projects and even just the design of them and like what they're functioning to do is definitely helpful, especially when you're kind of going on and doing these different types of projects, from these lessons learned of, how it could actually be, not good for your site if you do it, design it a certain way. So yeah, kind of, again, lessons learned for future projects. So I'll help since you don't have to do anything, Danielle. Looks like the next person on the list for questions is Josh. So if you want to come on off mute, go for it.
Hey, I loved seeing all the presentations, and it is amazing thinking about how long ago some of those projects got started and just kind of what went into them at the times and what people, the different regulations like you were just talking about. But Kira, I got pulled away right at the end of your presentation. So you might have said it and I might have missed it I was gone for just a minute. But it's really cool seeing that site again, after so many years. And to Kurt's point earlier, it does take that little stretch of time to really be able to evaluate how things are doing. Are there any continuing plans to revisit Sedge Island?
There have been off and on, but at the moment, there's nothing really all that active, because it requires coordination with a couple of other bureaus within Fish and Wildlife, and we just haven't had the time to be able to devote to it, and they haven't deemed the erosion underneath the caretaker's house as significant enough in terms of their other wildlife management area and land management priorities. So it's on a little bit of a back burner at the moment, but I know that Karen, who runs all of the marine programs out on the island, would certainly welcome any continued input or plans. So at the moment, everything is just kind of sitting out there, and we fly the drone flights and see how it's going.
Thanks.
Anybody else have any questions you'd like to ask? Yes.
I actually have not quite a question, but maybe a food for thought topic of discussion. So one of the things, especially at the Delaware Bayshore, that is, I think, tricky is trying to balance the objectives, is trying to reduce erosion over time, and also the fact that, for example, the Delaware Bayshore doesn't really have a history of intertidal oyster reef structure or any sort of reef structure like that at all, at least on the Jersey side. So trying to put some of those taller structures and those harder structures in there can be challenging because it's not quite the same situation that we're coming into. In other words, it's a creation factor as opposed to like a restoration or an enhancement factor. So in some of the other presentations where we're looking at like an eroding shoreline and the solution was to sort of like build out that shoreline, it was sort of just improving what was already there. Without too much of a drastic, like newer input. But then in some other cases, because of the challenges there, then we go for like the oyster castles or like a larger reef structure. So that's one of the things that I think is probably worthy of conversations on a site-by-site case basis as to whether or not you're really trying to focus on something that's like a rebuilding or an enhancement of that ecosystem, or if you're sort of creating something new that wasn't there in the past. And if you're creating something new that wasn't there, there are probably going to be different or newer challenges associated with that aren't a part of like the existing the habitat situation. So that's just something that I feel like is probably worthy of consideration in any chosen site, and those determinations of objectives, and then the selection of options and alternatives. So just an observation, food for thought.
Wait, Kira, you said that there weren't oyster reefs in Delaware Bay? I think I misunderstood what you were saying.
No, so we definitely have a thriving oyster population in Delaware Bay, but they're not intertidal reefs. So all of our reefs are subtidal reefs that are offshore. And they're not something that we typically find as close to the shoreline as where these projects are being implemented.
But I think historically, Delaware Bay and Barnegat Bay in New Jersey had, just like Chesapeake Bay, extensive subtidal oyster reefs that did extend into the intertidal area and were the natural wave attenuating structures for these areas. And just to add on top of that, I think for the Gandy's project, they had to be placed intertidal. This was before we had lessons learned that we could present and talk about and consider subtidal placement. But yeah, I do think that reef projects are restoration projects in Delaware Bay and Barnegat Bay.
So it depends on how far back you want to look at some of those histories. So like a lot of the oyster reefs that are referenced for the Barnegat Bay, a lot of those oyster populations were there because of husbandry practices, and they were all subtidal as well. So that was part of like very old leasing and very old movement of oysters around the bay. So we certainly had some wild populations without question, but the like the difference between the subtidal and intertidal, I think is, something to consider as part of, what the objectives are and what your likelihood of successes are. So again, it's just a factor to keep in mind of the whole holistic site planning, history, and then future objectives.
I do think both that. Go ahead. Yeah, Kurt, go ahead.
Sorry, I just muted myself locally. Yeah, I mean, I'll comment on in terms of Delaware Bay side or Delaware side of Delaware Bay. We do see intertidal oysters. I think our project was, we were curious how they would persist because there were some heavy, or not heavy, but strong winters that had some die off, but the oysters did come back. So I think letting the biology eventually take its toll, at least in Delaware, we're we see them. New Jersey is a little bit different, at least currently. But yeah, I mean, some of the docks in like lower Delaware, you got oysters everywhere.
We see them a lot in like the tidal creeks and things like that, more along the banks when you start to get into those like lower flowing areas. But some of the more like bay facing fronts haven't really shown, at least like a large reef structure in quite some time. At least not that I'm aware of since our agency started doing management for the fishery. But I mean, it would be nice to see them come back without question. But I think we have to think about the individual site characteristics in order to best bring back those populations, if that's the objective. Sometimes the objective is more than that or less than that. Again, all depends on the site specifics and the intentions. One of the things that probably would be really helpful too along Delaware Bayshore for both. I don't know about the Delaware side in terms of how the population is managed, but because we do the oyster fishery management for the state along with Rutgers, there's always monitoring that's going on an annual basis because they set the quota for the fishery and things like that. So perhaps coordinating with some of that in order to figure out where, choices of material and timing. That's always something that can be added in as well to kind of like really dial in all of the things that have been going on so far.
Yeah, I'll also mention that in New Jersey, PD's been working with Rutgers and DEP to look at some of these, these smaller tributaries, historically not useful for fisheries and, understudied. So I think, just the more information we have, I think to your point, the better decisions we can make based on the goals of what the goals of the project actually are. And it's, you certainly don't want to just put reefs everywhere because that's what we think works. But just even understanding where the resources are, I think to Allison's point, Lewis Canal has been, a major success story, and you just needed to give the ecology there a little bit of a boost, and all of a sudden you have your rib mussels, your oysters, your barnacles, and like a classic niche separation. So, certainly working where the resources already are, give you that leg up, and sediment as well. If you already have it, there's really not much to do.
Chesapeake Bay has an entire oyster restoration plan and has restored oysters like on these large scales in multiple tributaries. And it's because historically, looking back before there was even an oyster fishery, there were oysters everywhere. I think Delaware Bay and Barnegat Bay are the same. I wonder if that's a goal we should think about. Do we want to restore oyster reefs to their historic expanse before fisheries overfish them? I personally think we should. They have a lot of ecosystem services that we need in these bays, but maybe that's a philosophical issue that we could argue later.
Josh, you had another question?
That was just such an interesting, point that you brought up, Karen. And like on one hand, we're talking about looking to the future, sea level rises, building and constructing for what we see coming down the road. But as we start to see oysters moving intertidally, at what point are we looking to the future of habitats too? And also to Danielle's point about rib mussels being in there and thinking about what Kurt just mentioned about habitat succession and things like that. Currently you might be building for rib mussels, in a certain area, but as sea levels rise and as hopefully transgression areas are built and marshes can migrate, what's the rib mussel habitat now becomes the oyster habitat. So it's just like an interesting idea of, are there certain things we look to the future for, but certain things that we just look to the past and want to stay there about where certain things lived. So I guess that's more that philosophical question, Danielle, but those are kind of the fun ones.
Jonathan, you got another question?
I would just say, you know, on that sort of bigger question about restoring oysters, I don't think you could go wrong if you do, you know, beef up your subtidal reefs and intertidal oysters become, you know, sort of the future. You've got that spat source that could then colonize those structures and be a more resilient, you know, source for that spat. And I think that maybe I haven't followed it super closely in the Chesapeake Bay. We don't have a lot of intertidal oysters here yet, at least up in the fresher parts of the bay. I don't know about down in Virginia, but you know, my sense is that they're starting to see some more intertidal oysters on some of the rock structures in some of those, you know, restored tributaries. And I know that some of the proponents are really big on, you know, touting that restoration as that source for spat. So, you know, when you talk about strategies, it could be similar to where you talked about having like tiered erosion control structures. It could be, you know, like tiered habitats. Like you've got subtidal oysters, you've got intertidal oyster habitat, you've got, you know, wetland vegetation. I think, you know, thinking about things in steps like that, it definitely, when people take that approach, it definitely appeals to me more. And it's like, oh, okay, you're actually thinking more holistically about the system. And yeah, you're trying to address erosion, but you're also trying to, you know, do all these other habitat features. It's not a perspective I interact with a lot here in the Bay, I guess I'd say. So I've been really impressed by all the presentations today and jealous of all your intertidal oysters and all your oyster bags. And yeah, just happy to sit in and learn from some of the stuff that's going on up in Delaware Bay. So thanks.
Awesome. And yeah, no, I think, I mean, to kind of going back to the rib mussels thing, I mean, I think I'd be interested in seeing more of that too, because I feel like some of the sites I've seen with that are kind of having some living shoreline components where there's actually rib mussels there, especially it's kind of been helping out the wetlands. So I think it'd be kind of interesting if more products kind of maybe incorporated that as opposed to just only focusing on oysters all the time, which tends to be like the popular you know, like shellfish to really focus on. So I actually want to bring up, I guess maybe for you, Danielle, for potential work associated with fish usage. Our Milford lab had been doing some work with our aquaculture group on using GoPros to see how fish kind of interact with aquaculture cages and whatnot. And like they're still doing this work now, but they're kind of showing us some of their, at our staff meeting a few weeks ago, just some of the work they've been doing and how they're able to actually like see kind of what species are you know, kind of interacting with the aquaculture cages, and they're kind of looking into doing some more information on like, you know, like how like just different behaviors, and kind of getting more species information too. So I'm wondering maybe if doing something like using like GoPros, like they're doing, might be a good way to kind of around the structures too. That's kind of not super invasive, and you're able to capture a lot of really good information for that to see again how they're being used and by who.
Yeah, I think that's great if turbidity doesn't limit the visibility of GoPros,
Yeah.
which, and that's what biosonics, acoustics, and sonar are for, and then you can have some nets. You can kind of figure out, oh, if it looks like this profile, it's this species, and that sort of. I could do a whole CHARRM on my like thesis work, but we'll talk about that another time. But yeah, I think GoPros are super useful for a lot of these questions when turbidity isn't a limiting factor for sure.
True. I know we got about a little more than 10 minutes left. I don't know if there's any last questions before I guess officially, I mean, concluding this part, and I guess having our other discussion, Danielle, about kind of some future of CHARRM.
Yeah, I don't see any more hands. Anything in the chat? Let's see.
Not really.
Jonathan put a paper on rib mussels and marshes in there. Thanks, Jonathan. That's great.
Great.
Yeah, we can talk about this. So Josh, who's on the line, and Laura, and Martha, and some other folks that are part of the New Jersey Coastal Resilience Collaborative, and I have been talking about maybe CHARRM could be folded under the CRC's umbrella. The CRC has a lot of great resources. They have a dedicated website, and it's a collaborative. So it's not one entity. It's not U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or NIMS that is heading it up. It is a collaborative of different academic institutions, NGOs, state and federal agencies that partner together to advance coastal resilience. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the beneficial use learning network that Adriana from TNC started, but that was a work group that it was its own entity that is now housed under the NJCRC. And some of the great things that the CRC has done for the Beneficial Use Learning Network is a dedicated YouTube page to put webinars that are recorded and everyone can access. And then it's also a public resource, a website, a repository for data, case studies, and then even expanding this partnership a little bit. They have another work group that's looking at specifically research that we could team up with as we start to develop research proposals to answer some of our outstanding questions. So me and Jesse are really interested in this idea, and I'm actually going to ask Laura and Josh if they want to talk about it a little bit more. And then after they give you some more information, I kind of want to hear if anyone has any reasons we shouldn't do this. We've had a lot of tech issues. I apologize for that. Running meetings like this is not my specialty or the services specialty. So tech is another advantage of being housed under the CRC. Maybe we could do something like through Zoom instead, which I think is a lot more compatible. So anyway, all that being said, I'm gonna turn it over to Laura and Josh to speak more, and then we'll open it up to see what you all have to say about it.
Josh, you're so good at sales. I thought maybe you'd want to do it. I'm happy to answer questions. Yes, so the New Jersey Coastal Resilience Collaborative, NJCRC, I dropped a couple of links into the chat just to show you our website, our mission statement. We are not a nonprofit. We are not incorporated in any way. We are just a group of people. I'm a co-facilitator of the collaborative. Tom Harrington from Monmouth is also my co-facilitator. He likes to call us basically a community of practice that's focused on fostering sustainable and resilient coastal communities and ecosystems by generating informed action. So one of the things we do is we all come together and exchange science and ideas. We have different work groups that come together independently. So any partner of the collaborative can, initiate the formation of a work group with a goal that they have in mind. So, how this all came about, Danielle is a partner of the Fish and Wildlife Service, is a partner of the collaborative, and we've been talking about CHARRM. I've been watching at the advice of Adriana some of the webinars, and I know that there's been some issues with the video. So I said, oh, well, we had kind of talked about it a little bit anyway, but if you wanted to come under the NJCRC umbrella, we could house the videos. Right now, you can, the second link I included was just to the section of the website where the beneficial use webinars are being hosted. We are in the middle of, we're getting ready to build out a new website, which will be new and improved. We anticipate. We don't have it yet, obviously. Josh is the head of our ecological restoration and science work group. And they are in the process of creating a regional restoration document hub. This is where Josh can take over a little bit, but that was sort of the impetus for rebuilding our website to be able to house that. And then that's part of, so we have this ecological restoration and science work group. Eventually, some of the debate was, do we put BOLN, the Beneficial Use Learning Network, and or CHARRM under the ERSW, Ecological Restoration and Science Work Group, their little umbrella within the NJCRC umbrella, or do they stand out on their own? And for multiple reasons, we thought CHARRM is working towards a goal, and Beneficial Use is working towards their own goal. And eventually they may come under Ecological Restoration and Science as they've moved forward and sort of are all have achieved some of those key goals. But for now, we thought they made more sense to stand alone and be a highlight on the website as the important work, highlight the important work that you guys are doing. I don't know.
Yeah, I think we're trying to maybe walk a line, and maybe this is up for, it'd be interesting to hear other people's comments on this. And on one hand, like Laura mentioned, we're going to be developing the Coastal Resilience Resource Library, and so that's going to be a nice place to house these things, a nice platform for CHARRM to move off of, like the Beneficial Use Learning Network. But at the same time, one of CHARRM's charm is that it's fish and wildlife and nymphs are kind of at the forefront of that. And so when you have a large community of practice, one of the things I think you need to be aware of is just, if everything sort of just blends into one entity. And one of the real benefits of CHARRMs is that, it's coming from being organized from a federal standpoint. So I think that's where we're at with keeping CHARRM sort of a separate thing, but providing some of that support that the CRC can provide. So, as far as I know, the details haven't been worked out yet, but want to retain some individuality, retain the identity of CHARRM, while also providing the support that could, relieve Danielle and Jesse from a little bit of having to go at it solo with a lot of this stuff.
I mean, other than me and Jesse leading it, I think one of the charming traits of CHARRM is it's kind of informed by the resource agencies. What are the resource agency questions? What data can we collect to answer resource agency questions? We have a lot of folks from the state here as well. I'd like to keep that characteristic of CHARRM, and I like the idea of us being our own entity, but under the CRC umbrella. And before we open it up to the rest of the members, I just want to say CHARRM is great because we've got a lot of folks that are outside of New Jersey. We have a lot of Delaware influence here, Chesapeake Bay influence. I don't want to change that. I think it's great that we're all learning from each other's and expanding out of our region. Just because we're under a New Jersey CRC umbrella or on their website doesn't negate us from moving forward with our out of region goals and objectives. So I also want to say that. And now I'll be quiet and open it up. Does anyone oppose this idea? Please raise your hand or come off mute. Is anyone enthusiastically a yes on this idea? Is anyone still on the line?
I see people on here. There's 21 people in this meeting right now, so.
Danielle, it's Martha. Sorry, I'm down in the Bayshore area, so I'm sitting in my car for this. Laura, we talked tangentially about it yesterday with Tom and Meredith about it, and I think it's great, but I also see, Danielle, what you're talking about as far as it being a multi-state entity. So I think that's something that the group has to decide. I mean, I feel as a longstanding member of CRC that it's great if we can help provide umbrellas, like for the beneficial use and some of the other practitioner kinds of groups. But there is a trade-off, because once you kind of park under CRC, then are you considered part of CRC as opposed to the freestanding side of it? And I see there's a question in there about what CRC is. So Laura, you might want to give just the quick what is New Jersey CRC?
Yeah, that's why I did drop the website in. And I will say all of this is contingent on our leadership committee approving it. Martha is on our leadership committee. That's how she's heard some of these conversations and knows what they will be asking. So the NJCRC, so many things sometimes. So we are every level of government, from federal through local municipalities. We are academic institutions. We're for-profits and nonprofits. We're individuals that are just concerned with what's going on in the state from a regulatory standpoint and otherwise. All coming together with the idea that coastal resilience is a priority for our communities and for our ecosystems. And in some ways, we act as a think tank for discussing ideas and thinking about priorities. There are times where the CRC, like when the state of New Jersey was pulling together their climate change resilience strategy, they had put out a draft. We had partners that wanted to come together and create a document to submit with the comments on what we felt like should be included. There's always an option for partners to opt out of being signed on to any kind of document. We work from I think it's called a collective impact model, where basically, unless somebody says, no, I disagree wholeheartedly, as long as the majority agrees, we move forward. I've never seen anything come to a standstill in my 4 years of being part of the NJCRC. And then we also provide technical assistance to municipalities. That's another big focus. So within the NJCRC, so we provide, if you go onto the website, you'll see we've got a technical assistance directory. We've got the coffee chats that we do, which are geared mostly towards municipalities getting access to different tools and being made aware of resources throughout the state. So all those things do tend to have a New Jersey focus in that sense. But like, for example, there's also these work groups that come together to do greater things, and beneficial use learning network, also not solely focused on New Jersey, definitely focused on our region, because there's no reason things should change at the borders except from a regulatory standpoint, right? Those are the only things that really change. And same for CHARRM. That could, there's no hard fast, like, we're not talking about what's happening outside, because we have things to learn. And that's part of the model, right? Is that we have, everybody's invited to be part of the NJCRC, because we can learn different things from different, everybody's got a different perspective, and all those goals need to move forward in some way, or, well, maybe not all those goals, but they're all voices that should be considered, is the general approach. I don't know if that helped.
I mean, I see it as mutually beneficial. If NJCRC is New Jersey focused, having the beneficial use learning network and CHARRM that kind of have branches into other regions to bring information to inform the NJCRC, I think that that's an advantage. It's not necessarily, we can't just draw boundaries across New Jersey and be like, we'll only take coastal resilience information from this geographic area. That's not how we scale some of these things up and learn from other regions. The beneficial use learning network is a great example. They've pulled so many different projects from Louisiana and Connecticut and other areas. So I hope CHARRM can help the NJCRC in their New Jersey centric goals, but I don't think that CHARRM will ever be specifically New Jersey centric. But I don't think that that's necessarily a problem. But that's just my perspective, Martha.
And if anyone does have any comments too, you don't feel like, saying them obviously today or whatever, or, please feel free to, shoot me and Danielle a message too, if you have any concerns or questions or whatnot. And obviously we'll do our best to answer them and answer your concerns. So we got some time, and, I know, I'm sure a lot of you have to digest it as well. So, that's totally fine. And it looks like we're also after 3 o'clock too. So I'm noticing folks are
Yeah.
starting to drop off. So with that said, no, everyone, really great presentation today, everybody. Appreciate it. Hopefully we'll see what our future brings, and hopefully we will have less technical issues. I don't know, Danielle, if there's anything else you wanted to say for next meeting or anything.
I just want to thank our speakers today. Excellent presentations, great range of tactics and information. I will put this recording on the team site, which doesn't work for everyone. So hopefully one day it'll have a different house to be put on. But anyway, thank you all so much. The next month's meeting will focus on novel tactics, things that maybe don't have a lot of monitoring data associated with them, living shoreline projects that are in the works or being designed currently. Jesse and I are starting to tap folks to present at that meeting now. So if you have any ideas on who should present a really cool, novel, new living shoreline approach, this is their opportunity to present to this group, get some feedback, and we would appreciate it. So with that, thank you so much. Try New Jersey Coastal Resilience Collaborative. Thank you.
That is a major problem that we've had. We've actually tried to up ourselves in the Google search criteria to avoid the cannabis thing. It only became an issue about, what is it, a year or 2 years ago.
We're gonna have to augment
they've
the
offered
mission
to buy our
statement.
website though.
With that, have a great Memorial Day weekend, everyone.
Yes.
You can visit both websites.
Take care.
Thank you all
Have a
so
good one,
much.
everybody.
See you next month. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.